Great. Well, viewers, welcome to the Munk debate pre-debate live streams, where we're going to be talking to each of the debaters who are appearing on the stage tonight, give us a sense of their views of this critically important issue, the global refugee crisis. Our first guest in the series of interviews is Miss Louise Arbour, well-known internationally and here in Canada, former Supreme Court Justice, former UN Commissioner for Human Rights. She was also a chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court at The Hague for the tribunals in Rwanda and Afghanistan. And, I mean, I could go on, but it is important, CEO of the International Crisis Group, one of our really most distinguished international NGOs. So, Louise, thank you so much for coming to Toronto to be part of this debate. You have a legal background, and I'm wondering if you could start for us by framing this debate in a legal context, because emotion has driven a lot of our response to what we're seeing in Syria, what we're seeing unfold in Europe. We have you here tonight in part to bring that legal analysis.
Well, I'm glad you put it this way, because I really think this is the proper framework within which we can start examining how to live up, to rise to what is in reality quite a challenge. A lot of people say it's a refugee flow that is unprecedented, at least since the Second World War. And we have to remember that the legal framework that is in place, that is the 1951 Refugee Convention, is exactly that. It's a product of if you could call them that, the lessons learned from the disastrous lack of management of the flow of refugees, immigrants, people on the move during the Second World War. So this is, I think, the appropriate way to look at it.
And have you been surprised at the extent to which that legal argument seems to have been lost in much of the public debate that we've had so far?
What's actually really surprising is that I think it's fair to say, well, first of all, I should distinguish between Canada and other countries, because I think Canada has, people often, I don't know if they say it jokingly, but they say Canada is the only country in the world where you can actually win an election on a pro-immigration platform. And I think the last federal election, in part, confirmed that. But I think generally speaking, there's often a knee-jerk resistance to any kind of intake of foreigners, and whether they are, and even in some cases, economic migrants who come in with money, but raise the value of property. So whether it's that at one extreme to very impoverished refugees who come with nothing, there's often an initial hostile reaction, which certainly in Canada, has invariably been transformed into a great success story. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind. What is different, I think, in this particular crisis is that there is a vigorous effort to try to pretend that this is different, that these refugees, migrants who are coming, particularly from the Middle East, they're different. Why? Because they're not just a burden, they're actually a threat. And I think this is not new. When Eastern European Jews were coming to Canada, a lot of the same was being said. They're Bolsheviks, exporters of communism. But now there's this invidious discourse that they're all terrorists, and if not, in any event, as Muslims, they're all anti-democratic, incompatible with life in democratic society. This, I think, is what we have to push back against. This is what is wrong factually and I think morally repugnant.
Right. Well, tonight I think we're going to hear that argument that in a sense these are two different civilizations. A civilization from the Middle East, which has a different set of views around the role of religion in society, the role of women, the extent to which individual rights and freedoms should be extended or not. You again feel, though, that, let's say even the question of Germany, which is taking on hundreds of thousands of migrants, you feel that there's the potential here for these people to be successfully integrated over time into Western European culture.
Well, there's certainly everything in our history that suggests that that's exactly the case. Certainly it's the case in Canada. Now, whether Canada can export some of the mechanisms that have made that a success story, others can be the judge of that. But I think overwhelmingly, the evidence shows that immigration has been overall, short-term, medium-term, long-term, a very positive force for development. So the only relevant question is whether this group is different. And as I said before, I think every time a group of newcomers come in, the assumption always is that these are the true scary foreigners, not like the ones before. I think there's no basis to suggest
Catholics,
that
for example, were an example of that. There was a
absolutely,
lot of,
and in ways very similar to what is currently being said about Muslims. I mean, Doug Saunders from the Globe wrote, I think, really brilliantly on that issue, where he showed that in some parts of Canada, Catholics were seen as backwards, very high fertility rate, ignorant supporters of authoritarian ideologies. Their neighborhood were often poor, crime-ridden.
disloyal. Their loyalties were to Rome.
Exactly.
Not to,
Yeah, exactly. They had a loyalty that was fed by the intensity of their religious views, not wedded at all to the democratic values. You hear that today, and you want to laugh. You think, how can we have? And yet it's exactly this bundle of stereotypes that we hear being peddled today.
This debate, unfortunately, happens in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in France and now Brussels. I'm sure your opponents will say tonight, you can't have compassion without security, and that by allowing large numbers of migrants into countries like Belgium, which clearly have a lack of infrastructure when it comes to security, that's irresponsible and dangerous.
Yeah, now they'll say that. I think, ironically, this plays right into the hand of the agenda of this small nucleus of violent jihadist groups like Daesh, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda and its affiliates to some extent, who are using very sophisticated, smart ways of attacking the West by essentially making us self-implode, by forcing us through the tactic of these targeted killings in our capitals to scare us into abandoning all the trappings that have made us successful open societies. More security, invariably, that will be applied in discriminatory fashion against unpopular minorities, through racial profiling and so on. So they are teasing us into doing exactly that, showing an ugly response to human misery. So to me, I find it very ironic that those who are the proponents of these doctrines of exclusion are playing right into the hands of what in the long term will do more harm to democratic values and to democratic societies.
And I guess you find a certain contradiction in these conservative voices who are also supposedly proponents of individual liberty, of open societies, yet now seemingly to embrace the apparatus of the security state to further their objectives.
Exactly. I mean, the advanced arguments that have the trappings of rational, reasonable discourse, the bottom line is this is fueled by ideologies of exclusion, of racism, of hatred. So in a sense, I think what is animating their position is, to me, much more threatening to democratic values than the coming into the country of people who may not yet share their values. But if we're confident that the democratic model is the desirable one, why are we so concerned that we won't be able to make them embrace it when they have the benefit of living in pluralistic societies where children will be able to go to high-quality public schools where they'll be exposed to other views? So I find this ideology of fear and hatred much more dangerous, actually.
And I think it's important to note that the intelligence reports, as they've come back so far with vis-a-vis the attacks in Paris and Brussels, indicate that these, in fact, were not migrants who were acting as the terrorists. These were instead alienated second and third generation citizens of these countries
That's true. But again, let's not be unduly romantic. There will be some. And nobody ever said, we should not take any Asians as immigrants because they could all be members of triads or all Italians are in the mafia. I mean, this overgeneralization. The reality is that's true, that some newcomers, within the bunch of newcomers, there will be, as they are in our own societies, all kinds of forms of deviance in usually exactly the same kind of small numbers that we find in our own community. So I don't think we should obscure the reality that, yes, you know, it's not all going to be easy and perfect, but on balance, it is clearly the right direction, I think, for us to take.
Are you surprised at the numbers that countries, let's say, who are not forced to accept migrants have chosen to accept? I believe the United States has only settled 1,200 Syrian refugees on a population of almost 300 million. The United Kingdom, similarly, has had very slow official numbers of people settled. What do you think that says about the state of international awareness or where we're at?
Well, I think it's immensely disappointing. And as much as I think Canadians have been quite self-congratulatory because we've done well, I think we've still done only a fraction of what we should do in this particularly intense challenge to our friends and allies who are, you know, we are the product of our geography. The chances of hundreds of thousands of people rowing in to Canada or walking literally across the border, although some suggest that the upcoming American elections may change that, but let's not go there. But the reality is we are immune from the kind of management crisis that it poses when people actually walk in. So it seems to me that it puts an additional burden on us to be good friends to our friends who don't have the luxury, as we do, to do pre-screening through resettlement programs administered by the High Commissioner for Refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon, which gives us the luxury to pick and choose, to host families in the best possible conditions, in an orderly fashion. So we have to feel for our friends like Germany, and I think we should be extending a hand to relieve the pressure on Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, but also on the Europeans who don't have the luxury of these more orderly mechanisms.
Just finally, again, as a jurist and someone who's thought a lot about these issues, what do you think of the current European agreement with Turkey? This idea that they will now be returning migrants who've crossed into Greece, into Turkey, and then accepting these people back into Europe on a one-to-one basis, provided that they've been screened through a refugee camp based in Turkey. There's some questions as to the legality of this.
Yeah, and I hate to advance legal opinion. I haven't scrutinized the details of the arrangement, but the mechanism is not dissimilar to what the United States is doing by pushing back the burden on Mexico, for instance, to interfere with the flow of immigrants that come from Honduras and Guatemala. Yes. It's the same kind of principle which the Australians have perfected by sending to countries that are even not parties to the Geneva Convention. So exporting your obligations in an international framework is not really admirable, I think. Now, I can't speak about, I mean, Germany in particular, Europe in general, and Turkey are both at the forefront of the management of this crisis. I'm not hugely impressed with that particular mechanism, and I think we should be very alert to the danger of that, of pushing back to those who have even fewer means of dealing with the issue, pushing the burden back onto them.
Great. Well, Ms. Arbour, thank you for coming to Toronto. It's going to be a privilege to hear you speak tonight, and again, thank you for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. We're going to have more conversations with our debaters coming up momentarily, just in a minute or so. We're going to take a quick break here, let Louise continue on with her preparation, and we'll bring in another speaker momentarily. Bear with us.